It feels like this is
every little detail.
Or it's so many names. It's like going to one of those memorials in DC where it's every name.
Yeah, or like going to the church and all the lists of the list of the rectors from like back until 1700.
Yep.
Right? Like,
Yep. But this is the
like
kind
we
of
got to
stuff that
hold
people
on
would
to
have
this
recorded.
information.
Yeah,
right?
we want every name. Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Welcome back, folks. We are here today with a brand new section of the Bible. We are in 1 Chronicles, the first of 2 Chronicles. And this is a different section of our Hebrew scriptures.
it is, and you should notice it like right away. You should be reading along like, whoa, this is kind of different. What is this?
yeah, down to the first word of the book. You open up the book and it's literally like Adam. Rick was looking really confused for a minute.
I know, it was like, I don't remember the
there-
first
he's like,
word.
What is the first word?
Because I'll tell you what, this was a lot of names. And so, yes, no surprise that the first word is a name.
Yeah, and the first name.
Yep.
The first.
So this is the work of an author or a group of authors that we know as the Chronicler. So it's 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which were split in two, just like 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, because too big of a book to fit on one scroll, so you split it into two. And Ezra and Nehemiah, which we'll eventually get to. So we think the Chronicler wrote all 4 of those. And it's hard to come at Chronicles and the work of the Chronicler without comparing, contrasting it to what we just read in the Deuteronomistic history, right? Because it's basically dealing with the same stuff.
Right.
Basically it's dealing with the history of everything we've already read, because obviously it starts with Adam, as we just remembered. And that's where, we started with Genesis. And so the book of 1 Chronicles really takes us from Genesis through the end of 1 Kings.
Right.
Basically.
Yeah, I mean, it skips all of the stories.
Timeline. Yeah, no, right. All of those stories.
Just a lot of names.
So, and that's where we, like, when you compare and contrast them, that's where you can see, like, what the chronicler is trying to say by communicating this history, right? So we talked about the Deuteronomistic historian ad nauseum, and remember we think it was written while they're in Babylon. Everything's been destroyed. Their lives are completely turned upside down. They're not sure if they're ever going to make it out. And so the theological question that the Deuteronomistic historian was wrestling with is, how did we get here?
And it's kind of a trauma document sort of thing.
Because they're in the midst of the trauma.
Yeah.
The chronicler was writing later, we think. We think it was writing during what's called the Second Temple period. So this is after, spoiler alert, the people do come back from Babylon. They spend 70 years in Babylon, and they come back and they reset up Jerusalem. They're given money from the Persian king Cyrus to rebuild their lives and their temple and the walls of the city and all of that. And so that has happened, but it's not all put back as it was. This is not the early Second Temple period is not the glory days of Judah. It is a shadow of what had gone on before. And actually the temple at this point is much smaller and much sparser than it was when Solomon built it. Before Jesus comes along, Herod is going to refashion the temple and make it one of the great temples of the ancient world. But at this point, it's like sort of put together with spit and scotch tape.
Yeah.
And so the question that the chronicler is theologically wrestling with is, so what now? And what's holding us together as a community? And the chronicler really wants to point towards we are a people who worships, and we are a people who worship in this temple. And yes, it's a little sadder temple than it was before, but God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so we are still going to worship there. And so you see in this document, in First Chronicles, how much a part the temple hasn't quite been built yet, but you can tell we're getting there. And there's all of this talk about the priesthood. There's all these talk about singers and what we do in worship. And so it's setting up the temple as the center of Israel. The other thing it's doing is it's related to that, but it's presenting David. David is the central figure of First Chronicles, and it's presenting David, you will notice this right away, in a very different light. In the Deuteronomistic historian, we get a David who is very flawed, because the Deuteronomistic historian wants to say, well, how did we end up with losing everything? Well, it's because even David couldn't be completely faithful.
I mean,
we fell apart.
Yeah, looked at very positively in that, but with some flaws
with huge warts.
Right.
All of those warts are papered over in First Chronicles.
It's like there's nothing at all.
Like as soon as we'll get there eventually, but even in the section where his episode of adultery would be talked about, it starts out that story almost exactly like it does in the Deuteronomistic historian. You think, okay, now we're going to get in Bathsheba, and Bathsheba is not mentioned.
Yeah.
We just don't go there at all, because we're not trying to find out why we got here. We're out of there, and now we're trying to reimagine what we can be. And who are we? Well, we're people who follow under a Davidic king that was set up by God. So just two different books, two different sets of history written for two different purposes.
And would the chronicler have had access to or been relying on those prior documents, the Deuteronomistic history, those documents? Because you mentioned that one in particular, and we can get there, it's almost word for word. So do we think the chroniclers were looking at those older things and kind of using it as a source?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
In fact,
it feels that way.
We don't need to even think that from scholarship, or really the fact why we would say that is there are points in the book where it is very clear the chronicler is drawing on Genesis with these genealogies, right? The chronicler is not just making these up in his head. He has these from oral and written tradition. He's citing phrases that clearly come from Moses and these big moments in Israel's history, which he is refashioning to tell this story. And in fact, at the very end of the book in 1 Chronicles 29, in some sense, the chronicler is trying to legitimate their story by saying, this is Chapter 29, verse 29. Sorry, that's confusing. 29. Now the acts of King David from first to last are written in the records of the seer Samuel, and in the records of the prophet Nathan, and in the records of the seer Gad, with accounts of all his rule and his might, and everything that happened in all the kingdoms of the earth. And so we're not really sure what the chronicler is referencing. In some sense, this is actually a great window into the fact that ancient peoples often attributed the writings, like Samuel, for example, right? We talked about how in the ancient world, people believed Samuel was written by
that Moses wrote the Torah.
Moses wrote the Torah. So this could be referencing books like Samuel and Kings, or it could just be something the chronicler is kind of making up to legitimate their writing. But the point being is, it's pretty explicit. They're like, I'm drawing on history here.
Yeah, we don't know exactly what form if they had 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, what form it was in.
Right.
But they have some form.
Oh, the other example too of, again, where it's very clear they have access to these other writings is chapter 16 of 1 Chronicles, which is basically just a mishmash of various Psalms, kind of literally copy and pasted. I think
that was a beautiful song of praise.
It is beautiful. No, I mean, it is beautiful when you think about the chronicler intentionally has created something here from these other texts. And it's interesting, whenever we use another text to create something new, it's interesting to see, kind of like collage, right? It's interesting to see the finished product. But I think, I didn't look this up beforehand, but my study Bible says that these are some extracts from Psalms 105, Psalm 96, Psalm 106, among others. So, pretty interesting that it is explicitly citing these other texts that have been written.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the history of it, because we know that when they went off to Babylon, they became more focused on the text of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Because prior to the Babylonian captivity, they didn't really need the Scriptures to center their community around, because they centered it around the temple.
Yeah.
The work of the priesthood and the sacrifices, and there were scriptures, but like normal people weren't interacting with them, and certainly weren't reading them,
Right.
Because no one could read.
Right.
But when they go off to Babylon and there's no priesthood and there's no temple, the thought is that Israel would have realized, like, either our entire way of life and our religion and spirituality is going to completely die off,
Yep.
or we're going to have to remake it.
Yep.
And so in the absence of the temple in Babylon, they start something called synagogue worship, which is worship around we're not sacrificing anything. We're reading the scriptures.
Yep.
And we think a lot of the scriptures were written or rewritten or edited while they're in Babylon. And so they come back with this new perspective. They're not just going back to the old ways.
Yeah.
They're a new people.
This really, to me, speaks to, I think, if I was going to identify the main theme of Chronicles, which is continuity, and you kind of already said this in so many words, Rick, but it's answering a different question than Kings, which the question is like, why has this happened? As you already pointed out, these things have already happened and they're back. And now the question is, how are we still the same people? Like, what is the continuity here?
Right.
And I'm sure many people skimmed the first 9 chapters, but
What?
I know.
What?
Can you
Don't know
believe
who
it?
you're
It is
talking about,
only
not me.
lists of names and
I
land.
do not want to hear that.
I made a special note that the musicians were made note of in chapter 6.
Nice. Okay. See, there's some things to catch in there. That, I mean,
Just-
yeah.
It was like, that's random
It's-
and cool.
It's definitely interesting. But speaking of things you might not have caught if you did skim it, is that it starts with Adam, because it is trying to develop this continuity where it's like, okay, we have this history that literally goes back to the foundation of the world. And that section kind of ends, you might notice, with 9. And it says in 9, so all Israel was enrolled by genealogies. This is written in this other book we no longer have access to. And it says, and Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now the first to live again in their possessions in their towns were Israelites, priests, Levites. And then it begins to list people who now have come back. And so the point is, like, there is this continuity of what was before exile.
Adam to when we've come back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a really huge theme. And David really is kind of the central figure of this continuity, because this is kind of like the national story, right? Like, this is the George Washington moment. If we went into exile, it's like, oh, we got to, remember Josiah rediscovering the book and the temple? Like, this is kind of that function in Kings. And we were talking about how worship is the function here. And it would be like us being like, oh, we need
some future version of former Americans
Yeah.
finding a copy of the Constitution.
literally like, oh, we need to like read the
What?
Constitution and read the Declaration and like reset up these like practices. And the thing that makes David so important in all of this, and we saw this throughout Kings, God's faithfulness to Judah because of David, and we find this again here in chapter 17 of Chronicles. And what we find, I think, that's really important, and why he's so idealized, to your point, Rick, of like, there's no Bathsheba narrative, there's no Absalom narrative. Remember when Absalom takes the kingdom for a while and David goes into hiding?
There's no
none of-
Jonathan there.
There's
There's
no
no-
family distress of
There's
any
nothing.
kind. There's no political distress.
He's not
really.
dancing naked before the Ark of the Covenant.
No.
He's dancing.
He's dancing,
but-
and Michal does not like what she sees, but we don't get the details.
Right.
Yeah, there's
Because
none of the rest
it
of that.
might be embarrassing to David,
Yep.
and this story is about not embarrassing David at all.
Exactly.
Right.
And the reason why is because what is the hope after exile? That the line of David would be revived, that
Yep.
there would be someone who would come. And so in chapter 17, around verse 11 and 12, what do we see? Especially verse 12, right? He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne for a few years? No. Forever. And so the way continuity is maintained is like, this is the promise, the word we've used many times, right? Covenant, that God has made to the house of David, and it will be forever. And we can hope that one day this promise will be fulfilled and renewed in our midst. So that's the hope as they're rebuilding the temple, right? It's like this, along with the temple, this line will come back to prominence. And if you want this line to come back to prominence, you're not going to make David look bad.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it's really interesting because there's just these vague references to the rest of the family that he's got wives, but you only hear about Michael. And it lists sons, and Solomon is again the fourth son, as was in the prior account, but you don't hear anything about those other three sons, the three older sons, at all, and they have completely different names than the older three sons in the prior account. So there's no explanation as to why it's Solomon who's chosen eventually, as you get later in the book.
Do you think the Chronicler, knowing all this, do you think the Chronicler was doing this as an addition to what had gone before, like expecting you to read everything else? Or do you think he's writing it like expecting this to be the new story?
That's a good question.
That's hard. They did reference the other books a few times, kind of like, you've probably read this or you've seen this.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
I think it's kind of like trying to compete with other narratives, right? Like we referenced, and this was a bit of a theory, we're not sure, but we referenced the idea that you raised, Rick, that John may be trying to compete with the Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
And there's this competition a lot of times with ancient writings, and this is actually why ancient writings will often attribute their authorship to prominent figures, because they want to be like, oh, no, like this is the authoritative. This is the one from God. Like, remember when we talked about the school of the prophets and we saw in Kings that like, oh, there wasn't just Elijah and Elisha, like there was lots of prophets and they were kind of competing with one another. I think that's kind of what the Chronicler is doing, is like, no. You might have heard it said like this, but this is the authoritative story. And that's why we see him at the end, him, her, them, reference Samuel, Nathan, Gad, is like, oh, no. Like, see, like this is authoritative. I have an authoritative source. This is the history you should really believe.
But Samuel was the one who presumably wrote 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, which would have been the source you'd think that this would be competing with.
Yeah.
So then to reference him as is what I think is kind of odd about that.
It is a bit odd. It definitely is a bit odd.
But it could be, well, here's an updated take with the new, because there is stuff in here that's not in, or there's a lot of stuff that's not in here.
There's so much
that's not in here.
I mean, we gloss over the patriarchs. I mean, they're named, but you don't get any of those narratives. You don't get any of the Joshua narrative, or any of the Joseph narrative. You really don't get much of any story of the Exodus. I mean, it's like the greatest hits aren't there.
Real quick, I want to make one quick correction. 1st and 2nd Kings was traditionally not attributed to the prophet Samuel. Remember, because the prophet Samuel dies in 2nd Samuel.
I remember that was like a weird thing about those.
1st and 2nd Kings, we didn't talk about this much when we recorded these episodes, is traditionally in the history of Judaism and Christianity attributed to the prophet Jeremiah.
Jeremiah.
Which is interesting. I'm saying this now.
I think we did mention that, and I'd forgotten.
We might have mentioned it. I forgot
maybe we
too.
just talked about it before we hit record.
Sessions. I mean, we talk so much about the fact that in contemporary scholarship, we believe it's this Deuteronomistic historian.
And it wasn't really Samuel or Jeremiah or anybody.
So it definitely is not ever attributed to Samuel. So in that sense, 1st and 2nd Kings kind of is this other text that I think this author would kind of be like, don't really read this source. Don't really count on this one.
It's kind of competing with all of those, because you've got it's kind of overwritten the Saul narrative. It's overwritten the David narrative from the 2 Samuels, and a little bit given you, and I'm guessing in 2nd Chronicles will kind of overwrite the Solomon narrative.
Yeah, a little bit.
You get like kind of the beginning of a rewrite. You definitely get a different take, especially within here. David is the one who leaves all the instructions about the temple, whereas David had nothing to do with the temple, except for having the idea to build the temple.
Right.
And
then God says it's not for you to do.
Which is almost identically replicated here in that, I want to do it. No, you can't do it. It's going to be Solomon who does it, or your son who does it,
Right.
Beyond that, it's like a whole different way that then David just goes and does all the work to figure it all out and leaves it for Solomon to do. Yeah, it does seem like it's a little bit Like, here's a different account.
Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah.
the whole focus of it is so different that it almost feels like, well, here's this additional account to consider, because it talks about what to do in the temple, which the other records didn't say anything about how to use the temple once it was, assembled.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this difference too is Kings is really focused on the sins of Israel, the northern tribe. The Chronicler could care less about Israel. Not mentioned at all.
Who are they?
Who are they?
Right.
And is very focused on Jude, the tribe of Judah. In fact, you may notice that when the sons of Israel are given, Reuben, right, is the firstborn. And unlike a traditional genealogy, it lists all the sons and then it immediately starts with, and here are the sons of Judah. So even into the way it structures the genealogy, it completely prioritizes.
Like, we don't care about this.
It's like, we're not, why would we start with Reuben? Like, Reuben doesn't care, doesn't matter. Where is that?
Oh, so this is probably the stuff that we glossed over in those first 9 chapters.
You would.
And then it's like,
this is why you read it. This is why you read it.
You would. So that happens. Chapter 2. It goes, these are the sons of Israel, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, etc. And then you would expect it, like a normal genealogy, to be like, okay, Reuben's the firstborn. Here are now the sons of Reuben. Here are now the sons of Simeon. But in verse 3, you immediately get the sons of Judah are, and then it lists the sons of Judah, which is so funny because you would, as a modern reader, you would never pick up on that.
Yeah.
You would never think like anything of it. But it is.
This is why we're glad we
especially
have
'cause
you,
you're
Elliot.
Especially because you're glossing over it because,
because
Just
here's
a
some
bunch
more
of names.
Just
But
a
in
bunch of
reality, the genealogies function literarily and theologically for the chronicler. And this is the chronicler's way of being like, Judah is the most important tribe of Israel.
Yep.
And then we get that in that it lists out in detail the tribes of Judah. And another area we see that, which is quite interesting, is when we get to the Levites. Like, you'll notice that chapter is so much longer, and that list is so much longer and more in depth than other tribes.
Because they're responsible
they're really
for worship.
important. Yep.
Yeah, the Levites play probably the biggest role I've seen since we read Leviticus.
Yes. So, and that is, if anyone is interested in this long list of genealogies in the first 9 chapters, that's chapter 6.
Where the musicians are.
Yes. And that chapter's 81 verses.
Oh, yeah.
It is very long.
I know. When you're reading 3 chapters a day, like you get an 81 verse chapter, like, oh, gosh.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, it's like triple and double the list of other genealogies.
So so Judah is important because it's in Judah that the temple is, and then the Levites are important because they're the ones who minister in the temple.
Right.
Well, and Benjamin comes up, interestingly, I think because of the connection to Saul. And like later on, the Benjaminites, much later, there's a mention of when we get into the census, that's, the problematic census, the Benjaminites are upset about the command for the census. And so they don't get counted, which is also a problem for God. But I did find it interesting that they keep naming and coming back to all of the tribes because the tribes split. The whole reason with the Judah versus Israel was that like some of the tribes it was Judah, basically, and not really the rest of the tribes. And like kind of all of the other tribes were, quote, Israel. So they're kind of all being named and brought back together here. It's not just Judah that's part of this new order, as it were.
Yes.
In chapter 5, you have the sons of Reuben, Israel's firstborn. Because he was the firstborn, this is verse 1, but when he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, and he was not for enrollment by genealogy on the basis of his birthright, because Judah was strong among his brothers, and a chief came from him. Mm-hmm. Right, like so we have Reuben, but Reuben blew it, and really it's Judah that really matters.
Yep.
I think the chronicler does expect the reader to know these other stories from elsewhere. I don't think they're trying to write something.
That's
like,
good.
You need to know because like those are the kinds of comments that like they're expecting that you've read or that you're aware of some of this other stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad. Chronicles is not my favorite. I mean,
No.
and not even just because it's a lot of names and a lot of lists, but the warts of the leaders of the ancient world, I think are really important.
Yeah.
Right. Like
It's just kind of boring.
It is boring, and I can't relate to it because I'm not a perfect person, right? I'm not I would like all my warts to be
Right.
forgotten about.
It's less of the other stories are messy and you can kind of relate to them, but it's all about, like, entirely about the kings and their families in some ways. Whereas in this, you get to hear a little bit more about kind of the average people, not entirely average people. These are the warriors and the commanders and the people who are, but you get a little closer to the everyday person in all these lists of names of the people serving in the temple. 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are about the 1%. And then these ones are about kind of like your middle class and upper middle class.
Yeah.
And so you get to kind of get that rank below, as it were.
Mm-hmm. And I think the chronicler could have given us the same sermon on that worship is really important and Judah is really important, and still told like the full real story of David.
Yeah. Well, but here's the thing.
Yeah.
But is it real?
I think the challenge the chronicler is running into is that if you have the perspective of the Deuteronomistic history of what we titled this retributive theology, where if you do good, blessings will accrue to you, and if you do wrong, curses will come to you, the chronicler can't present the true story, because if you present the true story, you get the story of 1 Kings, right? Where it's like these people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, therefore these things happened to them. And so the chronicler has to kind of modify those warts and be like, oh, it wasn't actually this bad. We can take the good and we can do the good things now. We can worship the right way now, because this will enable us to like rebuild the temple and live in the land, and we can follow these people. Like, I don't know. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's almost like from our perspective, the chronicler could have, right? But he would have had to shift the framework. And it was almost like with the tools available to him, he couldn't make sense of this without modifying the history. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, history's tricky, right? I
totally
whipped
whipped that take up on the fly.
No.
I mean, it was really good.
I'm kind of that's kind of my thought. Is like you would have to, like, if this is the way you think about the world, you kind of have to modify the history. So you were saying with that, Natalee, history is complicated.
History is really complicated, and when you're trying to tell, you want to convey something about history, to convey a point of it, and the perspective and the point here is, how do we rebuild now, and what do we go back to and rely on? Some of all that extra stuff can seem beside the point, perhaps, and I don't think that it necessarily is beside the point, but if you want to be concise, I'm trying to think about how hard it must be to write a high school, U.S. history book, and you get a year, and you're not even going to make it through the whole book. Like the number of times that I was retaught U.S. history, and you start from Adam, as it were, and you don't even make it up to modern day because they can't possibly cram it all in.
Right.
And there's so much else that happened and so many other lives that were impacted that it's impossible to fit it into one book, which is why we have a plethora of museums across the country to tell the other parts of the stories. I think it's really hard to try to tell the story and get the point across without having to kind of gloss over some stuff, because your point isn't what happened and why we got exiled. Your point is, here we are now, and what's next?
Yeah. But I think it's really critical that the chronicler is doing it in an idealized form. And that actually, to me, provides good overlap with American history and different frameworks for approaching American history. And feel free to shoot down some of what I'm saying here. But I'm reflecting right now, based on what Natalee just said, on my time leading Sacred Ground here at St. David's. And for anyone listening that might not be familiar, Sacred Ground is a curriculum put out through the Episcopal Church that takes a look at America's history, and specifically America's racial history. And it covers a lot of really amazing ground. And what I found from so many people in our Sacred Ground course, especially people in their 60s and 70s, is we would have it moves over the course of like 9 weeks, and there's different units. And we do historical readings and discussion, and across the board, so many people would say, I never learned this in my history class. I never learned this. And I think what the reflection was from people in Sacred Ground here at St. David's was I was told an idealized version of American history, one that scrubs the warts, one that removes some of the flaws and sins. And because of that, I had a view of America that maybe was not the true messy view of our history, which I think we would all affirm. With that messy view of our country, we can move forward and heal.
Right.
But, and this was my point. This goes back to my point about like the first the chronicler's framework almost being the problem, where it wasn't this framework of like we can tell the warts and still heal. It was like we need to tell the idealized version so that we can build this community and heal. And it was like, actually, you don't need to. You can tell that, like, you can have this view of history that tells the warts, that tells the things that went wrong, and heal from that. I don't know. It seems like a real miss for me.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And I think that's kind of why I tried to bring up the parallel. I don't know I did it particularly well. Because, again, I think the chronicler expects that you've read other things. And one of the things I always found frustrating about my history courses growing up was that we kept repeating kind of like the same history over and over and not getting to the other stories enough. Like, I just didn't need to hear the story of the revolution every 3 years. Like, I've been there, okay?
Right.
Get me to Vietnam, please. Yeah, I think the framework is the important thing. Like what they're trying to say and what they're trying to do, it's kind of hard to get through all those warts because then you're stuck kind of wrestling with all of those bits and pieces. And we do need to stick and wrestle with bits and pieces in our history. And I would think that you'd need to do that here too. But I think he's just trying to... I think it's a miss, yes. And I think he's just trying to say, I just want to get this piece to you. I just want to tell you about the temple and what we do with the temple and how the temple works without trying to like rehash all of the crud that got us to the point where David's building the temple. I don't know.
Definitely.
There is a possibility, and I don't know this, but there is a possibility that it's not just that the chronicler sort of removes the warts, but he leaves some breadcrumbs. So like at the beginning of chapter 20, and we were talking about this before we went on.
Yeah.
Verse 1, beginning of chapter 20, at the time of the turn of the year, at the time when kings go out. So it's springtime.
In springtime when the kings go out to war.
If you remember from First Kings, like what comes next? Like
That was the David and Bathsheba story.
Everyone else is out to war. David stays back, and then he gets into trouble.
Yeah.
And Bathsheba is completely omitted here. But by beginning this chapter with a direct callback, the chronicler could be, without saying Bathsheba, the chronicler could realize that everyone is going to be like, oh yeah, this is Bathsheba. Like we know the story, it's in the background. He could have formulated this differently and left that out and had no breadcrumbs that took us to Bathsheba. But it's almost like, okay, I'm going to present this idealized version of David, but I know you know the story. And so I'm going to give you a little rift on the story so that it in your own mind, you recall it.
Right. Because it really does, that chapter, the way it's told, it's like, here's the lead in to what you would normally expect. Here's the very end of that chapter.
It's
where
just missing
David's
everything in
wearing
between.
The crown. It's just missing all that stuff in between.
Yeah, all the messy stuff.
Yeah.
But if the chronicler is expecting you to fill in the gaps, then I'm more on board. I'm more on board.
And that is always the tricky thing, right? Because the chronicler is expecting you to fill in the gaps, and in our lives, we don't necessarily do the work of filling in the gaps that are left.
Right.
And I think that's where this tension comes in that we're experiencing with our comparisons to modern day. But I think that is kind of what's going on.
The corollary to this in the New Testament is the disciples, who are constantly, in all four Gospels, are presented as complete dunces. Like they never understand what Jesus is talking about. They never understand where they're going. They don't believe Jesus when he tells certain things. They argue about which one of them is the greatest and the best after Jesus talks about, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Like they are just complete dunces. And yet they are, with all of those warts, are still able to be the leaders of the church after his death and resurrection. It's like the authors of the New Testament could tell the story of warts and God's faithfulness without, just cleaning everything up. Gospel authors could have. They could have just presented the disciples as these heroes of faith from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
But that would have been a huge miss because none of us are heroes from the beginning to the end. We are all extraordinarily flawed people.
This is just, this book is just dry and uninteresting. I'll just say that. And then, maybe this is why people don't learn American history, is because what you're given is dry and uninteresting.
Yeah.
If we're going to make that comparison still. Yeah. Because you're right, the Gospels they're interesting, and part of what makes them interesting is how many flawed people are in them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. I think you really see this with David. Like, I get your point, Rick, about the opening of chapter 20, but the differences are striking. I mean, I'm going back and I'm flipping through 2 Samuel, and I'm remembering these passages where, if you remember, David's child with Bathsheba, his firstborn child, killed, dies as a result. Like, he's like weeping,
inconsolable.
This is the moment where this is really the rationale for why he's not going to build the temple, which is not a problem here. Like, it has nothing to do with that in Chronicles, as Natalee
it's completely different. It's a completely different
just
set
like,
of
you're
reasons.
a man of war, so you're not going to do this, and even that, it doesn't seem to be negative. It's just like, that's not for you to do. And
because God is helping him do all of the war.
Like,
stuff
he prepares all of it. Yeah, and then even we were joking, I think, beforehand about there's this moment in 2 Samuel. This is for anyone that wants to go back and look at it. It's 2 Samuel 24. And David, this is the exact wording from verse 10. David was stricken to the heart because he had numbered the people. David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Take away the guilt of your servant. And here we joked about how, now granted, the chronicler presents David as taking this census. And when he says that David did this, he says, David didn't sin greatly. David's not a bad guy. So this is chapter 21 of 1 Chronicles. He says, my translation says, Satan, the Hebrew is just an adversary, which is often the way Satan is described in the Hebrew Bible. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. And so it's like, even this bad thing David did, it wasn't actually bad. And then even here, there's no great, like...
Well, he does realize his guilt and repent. It's around the time, it's right before he's given the 3 choices of the punishment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, he's still given the 3 choices of the punishment, and he does still, like, repent for what he did. Yeah, I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing, verse 7 and 8. But there's no repercussions. It's just like, I sinned, and the Lord's like, it's okay, David.
And so
but the repercussions land on the people of Israel.
Right.
And then he has to say, please, I was the one who did it. Stop punishing my people. Again, we were talking about last week about the punishments being on the whole of society for the sins of the leadership.
Mm-hmm. So we've been a little tough on the chronicler.
Yeah, we have.
A little bit. And I want to fight for him just a little bit.
Go ahead.
All right.
Is there a possibility that this is every bit as much of a trauma document as the Deuteronomistic history? And that the people have gone through this great thing. They are home. Things are not great. They are not back to the glory days. And could it be that the chronicler just felt like the people couldn't handle the full truth? And I think about like a funeral sermon. And when I give a funeral sermon for someone who has died, I don't usually go into all of their personal faults and failures, right? Because that would just not be appropriate, right? And the people who are grieving there, probably could not handle that. I could not handle that either. And so is this sort of there? Are things still so raw that we just have to, the chronicler's just trying to take care of his people?
How long have they been back is the theory.
Yeah, that I don't fully know.
It's just interesting. So they were away for 70 years, which is enough
maybe
for a generation.
Maybe it's 100 years after because they got to get back and they got to rebuild the temple. So if we're in the second temple period. So we're probably 100, 120 years after the Babylonian captivity.
Yeah.
But remember, for 120 years, things haven't been right. That's 4 generations. at least in the ancient
Right.
world.
Right.
Maybe 5 or 6. I mean, it's a long time for things not to be right. And so is that the time to like really needle the people and be like, yeah, and your favorite boy David, he was an adulterer and he danced around naked and he,
I don't know. I mean, it feels so far removed that it doesn't seem like it should be that raw.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And I do think it helps us empathize with why the chronicler is doing what they're doing and why they're presenting history in this way. Because we've said it a million times, but they are trying to build something back. When you're trying to build something back, you're not like, oh, let's all look at how horrible we are and all the terrible things we've done. Like if you're leading,
let's dredge it all
right.
up.
Like we were talking about how there's this moment in Chronicles that's really beautiful. In fact, when David is leading this offering and he's beginning to transition to Solomon, and this is actually where our offertory sentences come from in the Episcopal Church. And this is chapter 29.
Oh, his capital campaign speech.
Yeah, his
and
capital
stewardship prayer.
campaign speech. And it's really beautiful. It really begins in 10. David blessed the Lord in the presence of the assembly. Blessed are you, O Lord and God of our ancestor Israel forever and ever. Like, so there's this blessing connecting us to our rich history. And you get to 14 and it's a powerful line. But who am I and what is my people that we should be able to make this free will offering? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. We are aliens and transients before you, as were all of our ancestors. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no hope. But, O Lord, our God, all this abundance that we have provided for this building, this house, etc., it comes from you. It's your own, right? So,
all things are thine.
Come on.
No gift have we. Lord of all gifts to offer thee. Sorry.
Right.
Natalee's not the only one who can sing in this
That's right.
podcast.
So
All right.
true.
That's right. Bring on the singing. And it's like, you're not gonna get up at the offering and be like, oh man, we stink, right? Like, why don't you give us some money? But I'm glad we're connecting it to our own service because I think, and this is maybe to both empathize with the chronicler and challenge the chronicler, right? Like in our own liturgy and service, we have both confession and offering, right? Like we have an acknowledgement of sin and offering. And it, to me, I always had a priest that said it is very important. He believed that the confession came before the offering and before the Eucharist, right? Like, because we acknowledge our sins and then we give thanks and worship God in this way. Yeah. And that to me, that's a little bit of what is missing. The funeral analogy, to come back to that, is really good because I was actually thinking when you were talking about how this has all the warts scrubbed, it's kind of like an obituary, which doesn't really make sense because the metaphor doesn't line up completely because they're trying to rebuild something. But it is kind of like an obituary because, you don't read obituaries and they're like, oh, and this person did X, Y, and Z. But I've actually, hot take, I've always kind of been bugged by how obituaries don't like that we have a culture that doesn't reckon with our true humanity, that it is a time that people often are like, this person was so amazing and they did this and they did this and they did this. And like, that's true and that's beautiful. But I would actually love if we had a culture where obituaries were maybe a little more honest about our lives. Yeah. And maybe funerals were too. Like maybe it's not a good thing that funerals are not places of reckoning as well.
Yeah.
And I have to be careful with that. Like, of course, this is the world we live in and we have to approach this pastorally, and many people are not ready for that in the midst of grief. But I know on the flip side of that coin, many people, especially as their grief matures, and to Natalee's point, this is pretty far removed. Like there comes a maturing moment in grief where we do need to reckon honestly with like, these are the ways this person hurt me, or this is the ways this person failed me. And I can both love them and forgive them. And, so
I can love them warts and all.
Yeah, warts and all. And that's your point with the Gospels, right? So
by the way, both of my kids have a shared note.
An obituary note?
It's all of the stories that they're going to tell about me at my funeral. And and like, honestly, it's more of a roast than a eulogy. I mean, it's like all of the greats.
Sounds like it'd be amazing.
Yeah.
And that is some of the best funerals I've been to. The ones that are like, we love this person and also look at what they were like a lot of the times.
Well, I'm just thinking about, for some reason, when you were talking about at a funeral, you don't get this and that. And I'm like, it would be, and I did not watch the whole series, so there may have been a thing like this that happened, but I can imagine that like on Schitt's Creek, there would be a funeral where somebody would actually do the whole 9 yards. say all of the things. But it would be like for comedic effect that you wouldn't actually see that. You don't see it look like that in any serious dramas
It
or
would be
whatever.
David.
You know,
It would be David.
you want to give the chronicler a little credit. But then you also mentioned, well, they're trying to rebuild back, and so you don't want to confront them. It's like, but didn't we just say that was the whole point, that you can't rebuild until you've actually kind of looked at what your foundation was and fixed the, I mean, because then you're just rebuilding on a faulty foundation.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, I agree. I'm a Chronicle hater. I agree. I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem. I think the roots of the problem is that they haven't fully broken with the theology of 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Samuel, which there will be somewhat of a break. But we will find as we move along that neither really have Ezra and Nehemiah, and I think this creates a lot of problems in Ezra and Nehemiah as well. And we'll get there and we'll talk about that.
So it's a retelling with the warts removed, but the expectation is that you do actually know what the warts are, and we're glossing over them. So it's kind of like, well, you know what actually happened, but we're not going to bring it up again.
Yeah, maybe.
But we're still kind of operating under some of the same theology, but we're going to not really talk too much about that because we're focused on this thing over here right now.
Yeah, a little bit. And when we get to 2 Chronicles, it'll be interesting to see 2 Chronicles kind of continues the story of when Judah becomes its own kingdom, right? Like just like 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the split was when there was this secession. And what we find in 2 Chronicles, to spoil a little bit, is the chronicler develops this narrative about these prophets that existed in Judah and warned Judah. And if you remember, if you were kind of keeping track, that's not what happened in 1 and 2 Kings. In 1 and 2 Kings, we have Elijah and Elisha, who are prophets to the northern kingdom. And so actually the chronicler kind of has to develop this novel history of like, there were these warnings and there were these prophets, and a lot of them are like names we've never really heard before. Yeah. I honestly can't even think of them off the top of my head because you literally don't really see them anywhere else in the Bible except 2 Chronicles.
Well, we'll see them next week.
Yeah, so we'll see them next week. But that's jumping ahead to say like, yeah, they're kind of developing this alternative history that assumes you know it, but is also very much supplementing it. So interesting to see. It's history is not just neutral, right? I think that is a great takeaway. We use history to tell stories, and we use it to tell stories to usually accomplish some purpose or goal. And the chronicler is doing that.
Yep.
Some ways very beautifully and very good, like we saw with the offering, and in some ways maybe falling short still a little bit. Because as we'll find, the history of Israel, even after this point, is not one of rainbows and butterflies, right?
No, that's still
life continues to be messy, and they continue to navigate it and try to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, 1 Chronicles, much more to say about it than we thought we would have. Yeah. I thought, this was a lovely...
This was a fun discussion.
It was a great discussion. Yeah. But I mostly thought 1 Chronicles was great for like the archives, the lists of names. Mm-hmm. You always want a list of names in your archives. But that's what it felt like to me. But there's kind of more to talk about here than I anticipated.
And we'll get a lot more temple next week.
Yeah, looking forward to next week.
Temple theology.
Some new prophets.
Looking forward to hearing like what happens when Solomon is not young and inexperienced.
Yeah.
And what comes of him. All right, folks. Here we leave it for you. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley
Elliot VanHoy.
And Natalee Hill. Logo, graphic design, and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and MoodMode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org. Oh, the listing of the gatekeepers and the treasurers of the temple. That felt appropriate as we were approaching annual meeting.
Yeah, gotta include
Here
every
are
single
all of the
role
treasurers and how they take care of the money.
Is this the annual report of of Judah?
It might be. What's funny is that this episode will come out next Wednesday, which I think is it's right
Wednesday
before
before.
annual meeting.
The feast of the annual meeting.
And we too will see a listing of names in the annual report.
A great,
A great listing
Great
of the
list.
names of those who were confirmed and baptized and graduates, which I need you to review that